Don't be fucking trying to hurt me.
Last night, the officers were going to a burglary in progress, which at that time of day that they received it was a high-risk call, specifically because most residents are home and sleeping at the time. So a burglary in progress is going to be on your serious end of the theft crimes. So when officers responded to the scene, they realized that they weren't going to the first house where they received the call, but the suspect actually was scared away from the first house, jumped over the fence, went to the adjacent house, and broke a huge window into the place. He used a large piece of iron from a weightlifting set to break the window, made entry into the house. One of the residents, a 56-year-old male, was outside, gave the officers a brief description of our suspect, indicated that he believed he was armed with a knife, and also that there were 2 victims inside the house. Because of the urgency of the situation, the officers commenced a search of the residence, knowing there were occupants in the house and potentially an armed suspect. So the officers put together a plan to systematically go in and search for our victim and suspect. At that time, the suspect began to yell out to the officers. He could hear they were in the area, that he was armed with a knife and that he was armed with a gun, and that his intent was to kill the residents. What the officers did at that time is they called for a SWAT mission, which would called for a hostage rescue type situation. However, they still had the urgency of these victims who are potentially in distress at this time, so they commenced their search. Ultimately, they were able to locate the suspect and the 2 victims, and they were able to confront the suspect, who was armed with a knife. He immediately dropped the knife and surrendered to the officers. Unfortunately, the officers located a 74-year-old Vietnamese female who had some severe cuts to her upper body. There was also a 50-year-old female who had sustained some cuts as well. Both females were transported to a local hospital, where unfortunately the 74-year-old died at approximately 2 a.m. this morning. Further investigation revealed, and in speaking to the surviving victim, there was at least 1 confirmed sexual assault on our 50-year-old, and likely a sexual assault that occurred on the 74-year-old as well. Our suspect was taken into custody. His name is Eduardo Jose Torres. He's a 20-year-old male of San Diego.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he has a violent criminal past.
Yes, we do. We can't get into the specifics of his crimes, but we can confirm that he does have a criminal history, and there is violence included in that criminal history.
When the officers went into the house, was he was yelling at them? He was threatening to kill the women inside, and he also said he had a gun?
Yes, those were claims that our suspect was making. They weren't certain where throughout the house it was coming from, but they were able to tell that the suspect had yelled that he was going to kill the residents, and that he was armed with a knife, and that he was armed with a gun.
And what kind of charges is this man facing?
At this time, our intent is to book him under the murder charge of our 74-year-old, burglary, because he had broke into a house that was occupied. And there will be several sexual assault charges that, as the investigation continues, we're determining exactly what those assaults were, and so he'll be charged with that as well.
And do you believe that the suspect was under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or both?
It is suspected at this time, but of course, until we get toxicology, we can't confirm that at this time. But it's always a suspicion, as many suspects are, so we'll be exploring that avenue and investigating it as well.
And how do you think he got to the neighborhood? Does he live in the area, or?
There's no indication that the individual lives in the area. There wasn't any reports of anybody suspicious throughout the neighborhood. The specific location was definitely off any main thoroughfares, so it is likely that the suspect gained access to that neighborhood through an adjacent canyon.
And I heard some reports that he might possibly be homeless. Have you explored that possibility yet?
We are exploring that possibility. He did have a local address, but that was at least 18 months old. So we haven't confirmed and are researching that this morning through the homicide and sex crimes detectives.